Mrs. Wilson, who is 89 years old, finally made it on board the plane for her first flight after much difficulty at the airport. However, when she attempted to sit in business class, she was met with a great deal of unexpected opposition. Mrs. Wilson felt certain she had every right to be here, but would it make a difference in this situation? There was so much commotion around Mrs. Wilson that it was nearly too much for her to handle. Every single person on the plane was staring at her, including the flight attendant who was attempting to assist her. She was plainly at a loss for what to do. Mrs. Wilson eventually got to sit in her designated business class seat, but she was miserable. As she stowed her suitcase, her entire body was still trembling. However, an old photograph from her bag dropped out and was scooped up by the man seated next to her. He wants to give it back to Mrs. Wilson right away, but then he sees what's in the picture, and he can't believe his eyes. "Is this really yours?" he asks, but what was in the picture? Mrs. Wilson, who is she, and why did no one want her in business class? Checking in at the airport felt extraordinary and almost otherworldly to a woman who grew up in one of the state's small villages. She'd never seen anything like that in her life, and she couldn't believe what she was seeing. She didn't know where to look or where to go first because there was so much to see. Even though Mrs. Wilson dressed up for the trip, the way she looked caused other passengers to avoid crossing paths with her. They mistook her for a beggar or a low-income family mother. And it wasn't just the other passengers who thought she was out of place. Mrs. Wilson was unable to download and print the ticket online, so she had to go to the help desk to obtain a physical copy. But the woman behind the counter couldn't believe her eyes when she saw the old lady had a business class ticket and debated whether or not she should give it to her. Mrs. Wilson, on the other hand, was on the verge of missing her flight. She had no notion where she needed to go and was simply following other passengers by the seat of her pants. Unfortunately, she was trailing passengers who were headed in the opposite direction. Mrs. Wilson became a little concerned at this point. The aged woman just made it to the department zone owing to the assistance of a compassionate airport employee. "Mrs., you look lost. Can I help you with something?" the airport employee inquired. Mrs. Wilson smiled and nodded. It was the first time she had been treated with respect that day. Some passengers were already waiting to board the plane when Mrs. Wilson arrived at the department zone. The man checking the tickets gave her a patronizing smirk and directed her to the gate marked on her boarding pass. He suggested she wait there so she wouldn't get lost again at the airport. Throughout this period, the elderly lady fiddled uncomfortably with her pocketbook in her hands, occasionally checking her watch. "Is this your first time on a plane?" asked a pleasant-looking young man who appeared to be traveling in business class. Mrs. Wilson's voice trembled with excitement as she said, "Yes, it's my first time, and I'm trembling with excitement." That's when the boarding began, and the flight attendant requested the passengers to proceed to the boarding bridge, which connected the airport to the plane, with a friendly smile. At this moment, Mrs. Wilson was trembling. Mrs. Wilson's seatmate, who was young, noticed this and offered to take her into the plane. Mrs. Wilson fumbled a bit pulling her ticket out of her purse, so he walked her to the entry where the tickets were examined, and she pulled out her business class tickets, leaving the young man confused. He, like everyone else, was taken aback by the fact that this scruffy-looking woman had a business class ticket. He pondered purchasing one for himself, but it was prohibitively pricey. But if he played his cards right, he might be able to acquire Mrs. Wilson tickets. The young offered to take Mrs. Wilson to her seat when she checked in. She accepted, but she had no idea the young man was going to take her to his economy seat. He reasoned that this ancient bird wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But he was revealed to be completely wrong. To get to economy class, the two had to first pass through the business class. Mrs. Wilson knew precisely where she needed to be and stopped directly at her seat the instant they passed it, much to the young man's amazement. She thanked the nice young man who realized there was no chance he could obtain this seat anymore, and he began making his way to economy class, disappointed. Mrs. Wilson finally felt like she could take a deep breath. This torment was finally over for her. Or was it? Mrs. Wilson was seated next to a well-dressed gentleman. When he watched her sit down, he had a disgusted expression on his face. He slid his magazine across her seat and inquired of one of the flight attendants, "This is business class, isn't it? Why should I pay extra to end up sitting next to this old beggar?" The flight attendant greeted the man as politely as she could. "Mr. Thompson, please calm down. Mrs. Wilson had the exact same kind of ticket you do. You can see it here on her boarding pass. Here, take a look," the flight attendant urged, anxiously attempting to maintain her composure. Dorothy Wilson was up in a poor family with 4 siblings, according to her. Her parents, Kate and John Wilson, operated a small farm that kept them from going hungry during hard times. Dorothy was the oldest child of the family. As a result, she bore a portion of the responsibility for their upbringing. Peter, the youngest of the brothers, had a mental disability that necessitated extra care and attention. When World War II broke out, Dorothy's father volunteered for the Army and served in the Pacific Islands, fighting the Japanese forces. Unfortunately, John Wilson was laid to rest in a coffin draped in the American flag. Time passed, Dorothy grew older, and it was time for her to consider raising a family of her own. Instead, she was forced to stay with her mother and assist in the care of her mentally ill brother Peter. Kate's other 2 children have long since left to a bigger city, leaving their brother, sister, and old mother to chance. Dorothy Wilson did not meet her true love till later in life. She was 28 years old and had given up hope of ever getting married. Jack was a gorgeous shepherd who drove flocks of sheep around looking for grass. Dorothy felt like she was in fantasy as their love grew so quickly. The pair were arranging their wedding, but the Wilson family's terrible luck prevented the poor girl from celebrating her bliss. Peter, Dorothy's mentally challenged brother, set their house on fire one evening. Jack ran in to save him, but they both died in the fire, leaving them without a home. Dorothy and her mother were evicted from their home and forced to live in a rundown shack. They acquired it using the proceeds from the sale of Jack's sheep. Dorothy discovered she was expecting a child at that time. Unfortunately, her mother had already begun to show signs of dementia, which presented itself in hostile conduct by that time. Kate tried attacking her pregnant daughter with a knife on several occasions, blaming all of her problems on Dorothy. Dorothy's misfortune resulted in the birth of a lovely baby boy named Kevin. But she was terrified that her mother would inadvertently hurt the baby. Dorothy lived in constant terror for the safety of her child for 3 years. Dorothy then chose to put Kevin in an orphanage, exhausted by the pain and misfortune that had befallen her in such a short time. Dorothy honestly believed that the boy would be better off at an orphanage than living under the same roof as his grandmother, who may hurt him if she left her son at the orphanage. Dorothy stayed with her mother for a few more years before she died. Dorothy then returned to the orphanage, planning to return home with her son. Dorothy, on the other hand, learned that Kevin had been adopted. Dorothy had been looking for her son for several years after that, but it wasn't until recently that she was able to achieve her goal. It was made possible by a volunteer organization dedicated to finding missing relatives. She purchased a business class ticket to be closer to her son, who was currently flying the plane. Mrs. Wilson was able to see Kevin on her 89th birthday, which was a happy coincidence. "Now I can die in peace. I'm not sure if I'm going to heaven, but I'm very happy that my son Kevin is doing well," the elderly mother said as she sobbed softly. Mrs. Wilson's story did not disappoint any of the passengers. Some of them even changed their entire attitude on life. The old lady didn't observe how the flight attendant went into the cockpit after hearing her story and said something to the captain. An announcement came over the intercom a few minutes later. The captain said, "Dear passengers, this is your captain speaking. Our flight is coming to an end, but our lives don't have to end with it. Each of our lives is full of ups and downs, but that's no reason to believe that some of us are more fortunate than others. We all get opportunities from our birth, and our lives depend on how we use them without making mistakes." The captain continued by saying, "We will not learn the joy of forgiveness, therefore we shouldn't look for the guilty when there aren't any. as we shouldn't hold a grudge against someone whom we might not be able to understand. And also, I'd like to tell my mother, who is flying with us today, that I love her very much and I have forgiven her a long time ago. She's a good person and she deserves to be respected. The passengers gave the pilot a standing ovation after hearing his statements, relieved that everything had gone so smoothly. Mrs. Wilson hugged her son for the first time in years when the plane landed. The old woman handed Kevin the golden heirloom that she had saved all this time, crying with excitement. The dad meticulously shaved the family's heads and sobbed uncontrollably like a child. He's been waiting for this his entire life. It shows that you should never judge a book by its cover, because you never know who somebody really is.